Well, good afternoon. I suppose this is what you call a bonus ball briefing, an extra Q&A thrown into the mix for good measure, and one which hopefully will answer a number of your questions surrounding the next stage of the island's borders framework. We'll introduce our guests in a moment. Just to recap, if you like, to the stage we've got to, from next Monday, July the 20th, any resident leaving the island who wishes to return in the foreseeable future will have to apply for a Manx entry permit. A permit's not required to leave the island, of course. Anyone's free to leave at any time. But after Monday, if you are planning to return, you must have a permit, and you also must complete a landing form to provide your arrival details prior to coming back, within 48 hours prior to arriving back on the island. Further to that, some random unscheduled checks are going to be made on those returning to ensure they follow the 14-day self-isolation rules and helping to protect the island's wider community, really. And restrictions, of course, on anyone entering the island will remain unchanged, but there are exemption certificates will be granted to essential workers or for compassionate reasons. So just quite succinctly to sum the position up, I hope you got all that, by the way. You will be tested on it later. Without further ado, let me introduce our guests this afternoon who you have submitted questions to. I'm delighted to welcome to my left the Executive Director of the Cabinet Office's COVID response team, Steve Stanley. Good afternoon. And also the former Superintendent Kev Wilson, who now works in that team. Thank you again for your time as well. Just I should mention it at this point, when you submitted questions, some of them were submitted for Dr. Henrietta Hewitt, the Director of Public Health. She can't be with us this afternoon, but either through a further briefing or by coming back to you personally via email, those questions will be responded to in due course. Steve, let me start with you, Steve, if I may. Just an overview of the position that the team is in at the moment, the position from next Monday.
Sure. So as you said, from the 20th, from Monday, any Manx resident will be able to go onto the online services system on the government website, and through that system there'll be a portal to enter. They will register, they put in their name, their address and their national insurance and tax reference number, and that, if it's accepted as being proper, correct details, will then generate an exemption number, and that's a registration complete effectively in terms of future travel. So they then will be able to travel off island for any purpose, non-essential travel. And then when they return to the island, within 48 hours of their return, they fill out a landing form. We have that in electronic format, but there is provision to allow for paper cards to be filled in as well. And that will tally up with their exemption certificate, and that will complete that cycle. And in that particular document, they'll fulfill their details. They'll put their exemption number in, and that will complete that circle. And they can do that multiple times, and that information is retained for contact tracing purposes, should that be required, and also to allow monitoring of self-isolation, which is obviously the legal requirement, and the biggest thing that we can do really to protect the island from COVID.
Super, thanks. Okay, well, let's take our first question, if I may, and this is from Samantha. Samantha, thanks for your question. She would like to know, she's getting married on New Year's Eve this year, so that's something to do with it. She obviously wants all her family to come over from Scotland, Ireland, the UK. What are the chances of this happening, or her wedding will obviously be ruined? She wants to know if there are specific timescales for each stage of the borders framework, and are there any other bridges being explored, perhaps Scotland or Ireland for that matter?
Okay, so yeah, I mean...
No pressure?
No pressure at all, none taken. So it's always very difficult with anything COVID related to try and guess what the future might hold. So in terms of air bridges, if we start with that, clearly there's been a lot of publicity around the Guernsey Isle of Man air bridge, and that's quite well established, and indeed flights are due to commence next week. I think if you look at the hallmarks of what's allowed that to happen, we've got two islands, the Isle of Man and Guernsey, that are in similar positions in relation to their COVID journey and where they've got to. And critically, we're in a similar place in terms of controlling our borders, and that being one of our greatest defences that we've been able to deploy. That is a different situation to countries that have a border with other countries, for example. So whilst we wouldn't rule out anything at this point, Guernsey is the only air bridge that we've looked into and started to make that happen. Looking ahead to level 3 in the borders plan, that is something that would allow sponsorship of friends and family, provided that they self-isolate when they enter the island. And in terms of how we will go about making the decisions about when to move to the next level of the borders plan, It's informed by a number of factors, a number of indicators, and really they're reference points for Council of Ministers to consider what the position is in the Isle of Man in terms of how long we've had without any cases and what our status is in terms of our risk assessment, but obviously what's happening in the UK. Now, currently, the levels of COVID transmission in the UK are falling, and that's obviously allowing us to reconsider our current position in the borders framework and move to level 4. But also, there's other factors to take into account. So, you know, it's not as simple as just looking at those 2 factors. We need to look at what the impact of level 4 is and resolve whether there are any issues arising from that. And also, if there are any particular hotspots around the UK, that may inform the next decision-making process around moving along the levels.
Well, we're going to bring Kevin in a moment. Rob would like to know, multi-part question actually, in a way. How many people will be part of the Border Force team? Where are the team drawn from? And what legal powers they have specifically?
So the team has been built very quickly. Effectively, what that team does is it brings together several parts of our COVID response that's been deployed as we've gone through the COVID pandemic to the point that we are now at. So 111, contact tracing, and the team that's been dealing with returning residents and exemptions for travel to the island. And we'll also have a resource down at the ports as well to administer travellers as they enter the island. So it's a reasonably significant team that's been put together quickly, and we're very conscious that we need to resource that in a way that manages the numbers that we may well expect, but also manages the risk that goes with anything COVID related. So, for example, in terms of the port team, which is the team that will be the face of, you know, when people come back into the island, we're having around about 15 officers on a rota, which will mean that we have cover across all of the different sailings and the different flights into the island. Because that gives a sense, I think, of the scale at which we're trying to work to.
Okay. We'll bring Kevin in a minute, if I may, but given that just a few days ago EasyJet cancelled all their flights to and from the island until pretty much the end of August, is there going to be, and I mean this most respectfully, is there going to be much demand for the Border Force over the summer?
I think it's a bit of an unknown again, but we expect there to be. We've resourced for, I guess, a reasonable worst case scenario in terms of numbers of potential travellers. But also the team's going to be multidisciplinary, so there'll be different elements of work that they could fall in and out of if they need to.
It's quite fluid. Thanks very much for now, Steve. We'll bring Kevin at this stage as well, if I may, who's obviously Senior Investigating Officer with the Testing and Contact Tracing Service. Thank you, Kev, for your time as well. Let's go to Tom Poole, because he's keen to see his partner and his family in the UK. They were given the opportunity early on as a result of a compassionate exemption, but would like to know, can government give us a clearer picture on how they're assessing the situation? I appreciate you're not one of the ministers of the day, but are you waiting? I think it's fair to say, is the government waiting for a new number of cases to go below a certain threshold? I don't know if you're privy to that information, actually, are you?
Well, I mean, we have a general understanding of the decision-making
Yeah.
process. I think what I would say to Tom is there are a number of factors that are assessed on a continual basis. That's about the rate in the UK, everything within the COVID context that has an implication for the Isle of Man. So there's multiple factors there. And there is advice given to the Council of Ministers on a regular basis, and they'll make a determination around that based on that advice.
Could we be seeing lower risk countries like Ireland being allowed entry to the Isle of Man earlier than the UK, potentially? And would we expect quarantine if that is the case?
Well, I think that's difficult to say at this point. That obviously depends on what's happening within those jurisdictions. Clearly, if you were to talk about Ireland, you can't talk about Ireland without talking about the island of Ireland and what that means in terms of the transport links into the UK and other jurisdictions. So you've got to consider things in the round. So it's about the broader threat picture that COVID presents the Isle of Man, and it's within that context that those decisions will be made.
Do you see the Border Force becoming and again, how long's a piece of string with a lot of these points, but do you see the Border Force becoming a permanent feature going forward, given the likelihood of COVID being around for some considerable time before a vaccine's found?
I mean, there'll be decisions further on with regards to that, but at this moment in time, some presence at the ports and some management of entry into the Isle of Man is going to continue.
Yeah.
until such time as
But there's no
Cronin
date
decides.
on that. No,
There can't be
No,
a date
no.
because I perfectly understand that lots of people within the community would want a degree of certainty around this. And in a COVID world, what I found during my period within it, it's very hard to bring certainty. And it's largely governed about what happens out there. But what I do know is there are a lot of professional people keeping a weather eye on that and providing the advice against which those decisions will be made.
Thank you. Steve, I'll bring you back in if I may at this point, because just moving on, and again, if this is not a suitable question, it will be put to a minister going forward. But given that you're involved in the daily discussions and the high level meetings, can either of you tell me, is the government's plan at this stage based on self-isolation and sort of sitting back really until infection levels drop in other places?
So I think it's fair to say that self-isolation is definitely a key component of allowing us to open up the borders from where we are now, and it will remain a feature in my view for some time to come. Clearly, if there is a suitable vaccine that's found that can be demonstrated to work, or indeed a treatment or a combination of the two, that may well assist in reducing the period of self-isolation. But as things stand at the moment, that is very much part of moving to level 4, and it's, as I say, it's a really key component in keeping the island safe, but allowing travel across the border in a more opened up way, but trying to support not just the threat from COVID, but also enable the socio-economic aspects of the island to continue to improve.
Helen has been in touch. Thank you, Helen. She would like to know, what is the criteria to decide upon moving between the border reopening phases? You've touched on that. But for example, does the R rate in the UK need to be at a certain level, or the number of new cases need to have fallen to a certain number?
Yeah, so that's definitely part of the picture. So it's part of that indicator set of things that council will be reviewing, and there are points at which
that's part of the criteria, is it?
It is part of the criteria, and it's part of that trigger point to suggest that, and the next level may be possible to move to. But there's a range of indicators, and not just one single thing would enable that decision to be made. It's a balance of risk and what's right for the island at the end of the day, and the people of the island.
Brian Wood also has been in touch. He says, is there a possibility the border situation could move at different paces depending on where people are travelling to and from? Again, Kev's really touched on that. But he says, as the situation re-COVID is a lot better in Ireland, in the UK, do you think could potentially allow border restrictions to move to level 3 or 2 between the Isle of Man and Ireland while keeping it at level 4 in the UK? Just a little further expansion really on that earlier question.
Yeah, I suppose we couldn't rule it out completely as a possibility. There aren't any plans at the moment to do that, and certainly in terms of what we're working to at the moment, it's a move to level 4 for non-essential travel for Manx residents. We have to consider how we can administer it and how we can do that in a way that is streamlined and works to ultimately manage risk. So whilst I wouldn't rule it out, it's not something that we're looking at right now.
No, and just one more from Sue as well. She feels that the island is currently coronavirus free, and I think it's about 55 days now as we speak. The lack of control with the next step on July the 20th seems crazy, she says. What's your response to that? I mean, you can understand her frustrations, I would think.
Yeah, and I sympathise with Sue and others who have that view, because I think we've seen that in society right the way through the COVID pandemic. We've seen people who have felt that things are too restrictive, and others that would like us to be more restrictive. I think what I would say is that there are controls in place. There are mitigation factors in place around self-isolation, around the team that we're building to ensure that we control and monitor as best we can. And of course, there are penalties in legislation as well to deal with any breaches through the constabulary if they see fit to do so. So whilst I accept that, we have to move with what we see across the water in other jurisdictions, our own situation on the Isle of Man, and rely on the resources that we have in place through 111 and contact tracing as well. We are in a different position to where we were at the start of the pandemic because we've built that resilience in the team, we've grown our expertise, and we can rely on that to help us through the next stages.
It's an obvious question. It's been asked before, and it's one which will be asked again. But why isn't there going to be coronavirus testing at the airport and the port, ferry port, with mandatory isolation travellers until the results are available?
So the issue of testing, I think, has been discussed in a number of times, and it's probably one that probably does need a public health input.
Yeah.
But I think the key thing at the moment is trying to get any regime that is suitably reliable and would give a result that would manage the risk to an acceptable level. And it goes back to that point that our best defence at the moment is the 14-day self-isolation. We know that there are trials ongoing in other jurisdictions, and we're looking at those carefully through the public health team and DHSC. But as things stand, our position is that the 14-day self-isolation is the best defence as part of moving to level 4.
And again, it's, I say, an age-old question for months now, but they've been saying, why are only those who have travelled are required to quarantine? Other members of the same household can interact and then go out and mix freely.
So again, I think it comes back to risk and the management of that risk. The situation in the UK and further afield is changing, it's improving, and our current status on the Isle of Man, as you said, is plus 50 days COVID free, which is a fantastic landmark to have achieved. But I think we're at that stage now where we can start to, in a carefully controlled, managed way, open up non-essential travel. We can put in place suitable mitigations in terms of isolation requirements, which are a legal requirement. And we can also ensure that we can monitor and enforce that. And at the end of the day, it's about asking the public to continue, as they have done all the way through this, to do the right thing and make the right decisions for them in support of the community as we continue to live with COVID.
Thank you, Steve. Kev, back in the hot seat, if you're happy with that. And another question that's come in just a short time ago, actually. Returning resident due to fly back August the 3rd. Does he need to do anything differently?
If he's had, I'm taking it as a he. If the person concerned has already received an exemption to come back, then they'll receive an email telling them exactly what to do over the next few days. And so
everyone will receive that.
There'll be complete clarity on what's required of them.
Okay. And this is from John. His brother's resident on the island. He lives alone, elderly and infirm, has not been able to visit him since February. He would like to inquire if level 3 is achieved in the framework over here, whether he'd be able to visit him and remain isolated in his property for less than the 14 days that would normally be required by quarantine regulations.
I'm reading into that a little.
That's an if.
Yeah, I'm reading that a little into this, in so much as the person is travelling from the UK over to the island, and they would wish to return to the UK. When that comes around, we will be in a position to facilitate that. There'll be conditions attached to that, but we will be able to do something.
Yeah, he actually says he asked because being away from home in the UK for 2 weeks would be difficult for him. He's after some clarification. He'd travel directly by car on the boat from the ferry and return the same way.
Yep, there'll be a process for them to follow, and they'll receive really explicit instructions of what to do when they're here, and we should be able to facilitate those circumstances.
A question from Mark. If you were due to move to the island, whether that be to work, to family, business, etc., and can show evidence that you've entered into a legally binding contract to establish a business, purchase a property, does that qualify you for an exemption now, or from Monday, to apply to travel here?
It qualifies you now.
It does qualify you now.
Yes.
Yeah, super. Okay, and just a couple of quick fire ones here that some few people have come in from. They're obvious ones, but it'd be good to answer them just like that. How does someone get a Manx entry permit? If we can just recap that, and if they have to leave at short notice, can they apply for a permit after leaving the island?
Yes, the Manx Online Services, go into that, it'll be readily apparent. Travel notification scheme's there, enter that portal, it'll tell you what to do, and it's very, very quick. If they have to go tonight and they haven't had time to go onto it, they can do that. All they have to do is, before they return, register online. You'll receive an email to say you've been successful or not. And then all you have to do is the e-landing form on our arrival, and it's as simple and straightforward as that.
You've been saying that in your sleep, I think. It's up there. What about animals? What about animals? People travelling with animals?
There's no restrictions.
There's no restrictions on that at all. Okay, lovely. Just a bit of guidance, really, just to wrap things up. Arriving back on the island, this question is asking, how should I get home to minimise contact with others?
Okay,
I know this has been said a number of times over the last few weeks, but if you could just recap
No,
that
it's a really important question. We're asked it quite often. So, can I go on a public bus? No. Can I pre-order a taxi? Yes. and that can get you home. If I arrive in my own vehicle, well, clearly that can get you there. If I've left the vehicle at the airport or the seaport, can I use that? Yes, you can. And if you're going to come and stay with your family, can they come and pick you up? Yes, they can, and you go home with them.
Super. Thank you for your time. I'll just bring you, Steve, in for one last one. Bit of a curveball this from Mark, but we'll ask it anyway because that's what we're here to do. He says it's fair to say for the majority, unless there is an emergency, it's going to be too inconvenient to travel off island and then self-isolate for 2 weeks on return. We appreciate that. This obviously has ramifications for the airlines, but he's basically quoting Department for Enterprise, which says there's been a lot of interest in people moving here, either individually or with their businesses. But how is anyone realistically going to move here?
So obviously, as Kevin's just mentioned, currently people can do that. There is provision in law for them to apply, and there is sufficient availability in the law to allow for that. The physical,
They might not be able to fly, of course.
so the physical transportation of their belongings, that can also be facilitated within the regulations as well. So I think in that sense that it's reasonably well covered, and we have had people who have come through that route. So I think in answer to Mark's question, there's sufficient availability in the regulations to allow for that. I probably can't comment any further on future availability because I don't know.
Steve and Kev, thank you very much for your time. Thank you for all your questions. You could call me Jim, actually. It's Steve, Kev, and Jim. We can have this. For everybody who submitted questions as well, really appreciate that. Thank you. As I said at the start, with the Dr. Henrietta Hewitt questions, we'll either have a further briefing in the next week or so, or personally there'll be a reply to your questions that you kindly submitted. The address for any of those general questions you want answering, again, please visit COVID-19 community support at gov.im. COVID-19 community support at gov.im. Until next time, thank you very much.